"You have a good job. It's only fair," my father said, pushing the bill across the table with the same casual indifference someone might have when passing the salt. The words were spoken so effortlessly, so smoothly, so rehearsed, as if this moment had been planned long before we even sat down, as if he had known all along that this was how the evening would end. I didn't react right away, just let my eyes flicker down to the check resting in front of me, the numbers printed on the receipt adding up to an amount that made my stomach twist, not because I couldn't afford it, but because of what it meant. The meal had been extravagant, steaks cooked to perfection, bottles of wine emptied with ease, a dessert menu that had been explored without hesitation, all under the assumption that I would be the one to handle the cost. I should have expected this. I should have known the moment my parents invited me out, their voices unusually warm over the phone, their words lined with just enough faux enthusiasm to make it sound like they had genuinely missed me. The invitation had come wrapped in nostalgia, coded in the kind of careful phrasing designed to make me believe that, for once, this wasn't about what I could do for them, but about actually spending time together. But now, staring at the bill that had so conveniently landed in my hands, I felt the weight of every moment in my life that had led to this exact point, every instance of being treated as a walking wallet rather than a daughter, every time they had brushed aside my own struggles because they assumed I was always fine, always stable, always the responsible one who could handle anything. I glanced up, studying their faces, the way my mother sipped the last of her wine without a care in the world, the way my father leaned back in his chair with the easy satisfaction of someone who had just gotten exactly what they wanted. They weren't worried, not even a little, because they had done this before, because they had always done this, and they knew I had never once put up a fight. I didn't argue. I didn't tell them how humiliating it was to sit there, knowing that I had been tricked into footing the bill under the guise of a family dinner, knowing that I had been invited, not as a guest, but as a financier. I didn't remind them that I had spent years pulling myself up, that I had built everything I had with no help from them, that I had fought for every ounce of stability while they had made reckless decisions and expected me to cushion their fall. Instead, I reached for my wallet, slid my card across the table, and handed it to the waiter without a single word. And that was when I saw it, the flicker of satisfaction that crossed my father's face, the way my mother smiled just slightly before turning her attention to her phone, the complete and total lack of hesitation, as if this wasn't just expected, but deserved. They weren't grateful. They weren't even surprised. They were just relieved that they had, once again, gotten away with it. I sat there listening as they laughed about how full they were, how they had ordered just the right amount, how they should do this more often, and I felt something inside me shift. This wasn't about money, not really, not in the way they wanted me to believe. This was about control. They had spent years making sure I understood my role in the family dynamic, years ensuring that I never questioned why I was always the one who had to step up, why I was the one expected to be the responsible one, why they never once considered.
Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
That maybe, just maybe, I deserved to be taken care of too. But this time was different. Because this time, I wasn't just going to sit there and let it happen. As the waiter returned with the receipt and my card, I signed my name with careful precision, my movements slow and deliberate, my mind already racing with possibilities, with a quiet, calculated idea that had begun forming the moment my father slid that check toward me. I placed the pen down, folded the receipt, and looked up just in time to see them standing, stretching, moving toward the door with the same ease as if they had just wrapped up a pleasant evening, completely oblivious to the fact that something had shifted. I watched as they walked out, smiling, chatting, acting as if this was just another normal night, and I felt a slow smirk curl at the corner of my lips, a quiet, knowing expression that they never once turned back to see. They had no idea what was waiting for them outside. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to let them walk away so easily. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of something I couldn't quite name pressing down on my chest, something heavy, something suffocating, something that had been there for years, but had never felt as undeniable as it did now. The dinner had come and gone. My parents had walked away satisfied, their bellies full and their wallets untouched, while I had sat there with the receipt in my hand, the ink from my signature still drying, realizing with absolute clarity that this wasn't a one-time thing. It had never been a one-time thing. I had spent years convincing myself that these moments were small, insignificant, the kind of things that happened in every family, the kind of obligations that weren't really obligations, but just part of the unspoken contract between parents and children. But as I lay there in the darkness, replaying every instance where I had been expected to pay, to step up, to be the responsible one while they made reckless choices without a second thought, I realized that this had always been my role. They had never helped me, not once. When I was in college, barely scraping by on scholarships and part-time jobs, they had never offered to send me a single dollar, never asked if I needed help with rent, never called to make sure I had enough to eat. But when my father wanted a new TV, when my mother decided she needed an upgraded kitchen, when their car broke down and they didn't want to dip into their savings, I was the first number they called. When I graduated and got my first job, I had been proud of myself, had felt something real and tangible in the knowledge that I had built a life entirely on my own. But the second they heard that I was making a stable income, the second they realized I had pulled myself out of the financial struggle they had never once helped me with, they started finding excuses, little ways to make sure that my success benefited them more than it ever benefited me. It had started small, a temporary loan here, can you cover this month's bill there, but it had never ended, because the moment they saw that I would say yes, they never stopped asking. I had paid off my student loans on my own, without any congratulations, without a single acknowledgement that I had done something they had told me was impossible, and yet, when they needed money for vacation, when they wanted to remodel the guest bathroom, suddenly I was the first person they turned to. They had never once asked if I was okay, never once checked if I was saving for my own future, never once wondered if maybe I was tired of being their safety net. Because in their eyes, I wasn't a daughter. I was an investment. And the return on that investment? My silence. My compliance. My willingness to pick up the check without question. I sat up in bed, pushing the blankets off me, my fingers clenching around the edge of the mattress as a realization settled over me like ice in my veins. I had let them do this. Not because I was weak, not because I didn't see what was happening, but because I had wanted to believe that it wasn't what it looked like, that they loved me, that they cared about me as more than just a financial asset. But love wasn't supposed to feel like this, like a ledger with debts that only went one way, like an expectation that I would always be the one to fix things, like I owed them something for simply existing. And now, I was done. I wasn't going to confront them, wasn't going to scream or cry or demand an explanation that I knew would never come, because people like them, people who take and never once stop to think about what it costs the person they're taking from, don't change just because you ask them to. If I wanted to win, I had to play a different game. I had to stop playing by their rules. So I grabbed my laptop, flipped it open, and started typing, my fingers moving with a clarity I hadn't felt in years, searching, digging, following every digital breadcrumb they had left behind, because if they had spent years treating me like an ATM, I wanted to know exactly what they were spending my money on. At first, it was the usual nonsense. Luxury purchases they had no business affording, extravagant gifts they had bought for themselves under the assumption that someone else would clean up the mess when the credit card bill arrived. But the deeper I went, the more I searched, the more I realized that this wasn't just irresponsibility. It was something worse. Because buried between transactions and withdrawals, hidden under layers of expenses that didn't make sense, was something I hadn't been expecting. Something that made my stomach turn. Something that told me this wasn't just about money. And that was when I knew this wasn't just about making them pay for dinner. This was about making them pay for everything. I stared at my screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, my heart pounding steadily against my ribs as I scrolled through the endless trail of financial wreckage my parents had left behind. The deeper I dug, the worse it got, and with every new piece of information I uncovered, the more I realized that this wasn't just a case of poor money management or a few irresponsible purchases. This was years of deliberate recklessness, covered up with lies, excuses, and the expectation that someone else would always clean up the mess. They were drowning. The bank statements told me everything I needed to know. a perfect timeline of financial chaos disguised beneath the surface of their seemingly stable lives. The credit cards maxed out to limits that should have been impossible, personal loans taken out under the guise of home renovations that had never actually happened, payments missed, and pushed back so many times that they were on the verge of collections. It wasn't just bad spending habits. It was systematic self-destruction. I scrolled through transactions that didn't make sense, withdrawals that had no clear destination, large sums of money being moved around as if they were trying to cover up the damage rather than actually fix it. They had been playing a game of financial whack-a-mole, moving debt from one place to another, paying off just enough to keep the collectors from knocking on their door, all while pretending that everything was fine. But the most infuriating part? They had never once mentioned it. Never once had they admitted that they were struggling. Never once had they asked for actual help in a way that acknowledged the weight of what they had done. Instead, they had treated me like their personal safety net, like an unlimited resource they could tap into whenever things got too close to crumbling, all while acting as if they were doing me some kind of favor by allowing me to help them. I could feel the anger rising in my chest, slow and steady, not the kind that burned hot and reckless, but the kind that settled deep into my bones, cold and calculated, the kind that made me realize I had been played for years without ever fully understanding the game. And now, I had something they didn't know I had. Leverage. Because for the first time, I could see the truth they had spent so much time trying to hide. Not only were they in deep financial trouble, but they needed me far more than I needed them. All this time, they had acted as if they were doing me a favor by letting me pay, as if my contributions were just a natural part of being in the family, as if my hard work was simply an extension of their own. But the reality was that they had built their entire house of cards on the assumption that I would always be there to hold it up. And now I had a choice. I could confront them outright, demand an explanation, throw the evidence in their faces, and watch them scramble for excuses. But that would be too easy, too predictable, too much like what they expected me to do.
No.
If I wanted to win, I had to play smarter than they did. So I started planting traps. Subtle things at first, slipping little bits of misinformation into conversations, pretending to be oblivious just to see how they reacted, waiting to see if they would fall back into their usual patterns without realizing I was no longer playing along. At our next phone call, my mother casually mentioned how expensive things were getting, how the economy was tough, how she and my father were just trying to keep up with everything, her tone dripping with just enough artificial sweetness to make it seem like an innocent complaint rather than a setup. Normally, I would have taken the bait. Normally, I would have asked if they needed help. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, kept my voice light, and said, "Oh yeah, I totally get it. I've actually been cutting back on spending myself. Trying to be more responsible, you know?" Silence. Just for a second. A pause that was just barely noticeable, a slight hesitation, a recalculation happening in real time as she realized that the script wasn't playing out the way she had expected it to. "Oh," she said finally, laughing a little too quickly. "That's good. Always smart to save when you can." She didn't push any further that night. But I knew it was only a matter of time before she did. And when she did, I would be ready. I had spent my entire life being the one who picked up the slack, the one who made sure things got handled, the one who stepped up when no one else would, and for years, I had convinced myself that this was just how things were supposed to be. I had told myself that it was normal to be the responsible one, to be the person everyone relied on, to be the one expected to hold things together while others made messes they never planned on cleaning up. But now, as I sat across from my parents in their perfectly decorated living room, watching them sip their overpriced coffee, pretending as if everything in their lives was perfectly fine, I finally understood what had really been happening all these years. They had never seen me as their daughter. They had seen me as a solution to their problems. And now that I knew the truth, now that I had proof of their financial ruin, proof that their stability was nothing more than a well-rehearsed illusion, I wasn't just going to sit back and wait for them to try and take advantage of me again. I was going to make them show their cards first. So I smiled, played the role I had always played, pretended I had no idea that they were drowning, no idea that every polite conversation, every forced laugh, every carefully chosen word was just another attempt to lull me into a sense of obligation. And then, just as I expected, the first crack appeared. "We've just been so busy lately." My mother sighed. shaking her head dramatically as she set down her coffee cup, her fingers smoothing out the wrinkles on her designer blouse, the same one I had seen her wear in countless Facebook photos from vacations I hadn't even known they had taken. With everything going on, life, expenses, it just feels like things are piling up faster than we can keep up. I nodded slowly, making sure my expression remained neutral, as if I hadn't just watched her carefully place that sentence like a perfectly calculated chess move. Yeah, I said, exhaling like I had been completely fooled by her performance. Things are getting expensive for everyone. Another pause. A beat of silence just long enough to feel unnatural. I saw the hesitation in her eyes, the brief flicker of uncertainty, as if she was trying to decide whether to push further or wait for me to offer first. But I didn't offer. I just took a sip of my drink, casually scrolling through my phone like I had no idea what she was getting at, like I wasn't fully aware that she was waiting for me to take the bait first. And when I didn't, she switched tactics. It's just hard sometimes, she continued, carefully adjusting the bracelet on her wrist, the same bracelet I had once overheard her telling a friend was a little splurge from a shopping trip last year. Your father and I have worked so hard, but unexpected things keep coming up. You know how it is. I bit back a smirk because this was the exact moment I had been waiting for. The moment where she would start dropping hints, waiting to see how quickly I would rush to fill in the blanks, waiting for me to do what I had always done. Offer to step in, offer to fix it, offer to carry a weight that had never been mine to carry in the first place. I leaned forward slightly, feigning concern, tilting my head just enough to make it seem like I was finally taking the bait. Oh wow, I said, keeping my tone light, innocent, interested but not overly eager. Is everything okay? And just like that, the floodgates opened. My mother sighed again, a little more dramatically this time, as if she had been holding in some terrible burden and was finally letting it spill out in front of me. Well, she said, lowering her voice slightly, as if this was some deeply personal confession rather than a carefully orchestrated manipulation. We've just had some unexpected costs lately, and things are a little tight. We're figuring it out, of course, but... She trailed off deliberately, leaving the sentence open-ended, waiting for me to fill in the silence with an offer to help. But I didn't. I just nodded, pretending to absorb the information, forcing her to sit in her own unfinished words, forcing her to be the one to actually ask for what she wanted instead of letting me hand it to her on a silver platter, like I had always done before. She hesitated, shifting slightly in her seat, glancing toward my father as if expecting him to step in and help move things along. He cleared his throat, tapping his fingers against the side of his coffee mug, finally speaking for the first time since the conversation had started. You know, Mia, he said, his voice taking on that familiar, authoritative tone, the same one he had always used when trying to make me feel guilty for something I shouldn't have felt guilty for. It's times like these that family helps each other out. We've always looked out for you, made sure you had everything you needed, and now that you're in a good place, it's only fair that we all support each other, don't you think? I almost laughed. Almost. Because there it was, the final, unspoken expectation, laid out as if it was the most reasonable thing in the world. They weren't asking for help. They were telling me I owed it to them. I let the silence hang between us for a moment, let them sit with their own entitlement, let them believe that I was actually considering what they had just said. And then, slowly, carefully, I smiled. You know what? I said, leaning back slightly, watching as their expressions shifted into something smug, something victorious, something that told me they thought they had won. Maybe I could help. My mother's face lit up instantly, her entire posture shifting as she leaned forward eagerly, her hands clasping together as if she had already gotten exactly what she wanted. Oh, sweetheart, that would mean so much, she said quickly, her voice dripping with manufactured gratitude, the kind that would disappear the second the money hit their account. I held up a hand before she could continue. But, I added, letting the words stretch just long enough to wipe the relief off her face. I'd love to talk about it over dinner. Why don't we meet next weekend? My treat. I watched as my father hesitated, his brows pulling together slightly, as if sensing that something wasn't quite right, as if realizing that I was the one setting the terms now, not them. But it was too late, because they had taken the bait, and they had no idea what was coming next. I had spent my entire life watching my parents manipulate situations to their advantage, playing the long game, setting the stage so that every interaction, every moment, every carefully chosen word worked in their favor. They had mastered the art of entitlement, had perfected the ability to twist reality until their wants became other people's responsibilities, had convinced themselves that the world, and more importantly, I, owed them something simply for existing. But now, for the first time, I was the one pulling the strings. I had picked the restaurant with precision, selecting a place so upscale, so ludicrously expensive, that even people with real money would hesitate before ordering freely from the menu. It wasn't the kind of place where you went just to have a casual meal. It was the kind of place where people dressed to impress, where reservations were booked months in advance, where every dish was plated like a work of art and priced like a luxury car payment. I wanted them to feel comfortable, to feel like they had already won, to believe, just for a little while, that this was another meal they would walk away from without consequence. And so, when I made the reservation, I did it in their name. It wasn't difficult. A simple phone call, a polite conversation, a few questions about seating preferences, and just like that, their names were on the books. I had made sure to request a premium table, one that offered a beautiful view of the city's skyline, one that would make them feel like they belonged there, like they deserved to be there, like they had every right to expect the night to go exactly the way they imagined. When the evening arrived, I wasn't surprised to find them already seated when I walked in, my mother's eyes sparkling with excitement as she took in the grandeur of the restaurant, my father lounging back in his chair with the kind of smug confidence that told me he had already assumed I would be paying. They had dressed for the occasion. My mother in a designer dress I knew she couldn't afford, my father in a suit that looked just a little too new, a little too crisp, as if purchased specifically for the illusion of wealth rather than necessity. "Sweetheart," my mother beamed as I approached, reaching out to squeeze my hand like she had just invited me into her world rather than the other way around. "This place is incredible. What a wonderful choice." I smiled back, settling into my seat, keeping my voice light, my expression easy, my movements casual, letting them believe, just for a little longer, that they were in control. We ordered drinks first, top-shelf cocktails with names that sounded more like poetry than beverages, then appetizers that came served on pristine white plates with sauces drizzled in delicate patterns, each bite designed to be savored, to be appreciated. My parents didn't hold back, didn't hesitate, didn't second-guess their selections, because they had already convinced themselves that none of this would cost them a dime. By the time the entrees arrived, they were in rare form, laughing, talking, basking in the feeling of indulgence, sipping from their glasses with the satisfaction of people who believed they had life figured out. My mother told stories about friends who envied her lifestyle. My father made offhand comments about how they always knew I would do well for myself, that I was successful because of the values they had instilled in me, as if they had ever contributed anything to my success beyond guilt trips and emotional debts I had never agreed to pay. I let them talk. I let them enjoy the moment, let them believe that the night was unfolding exactly the way they had planned, let them order another round of drinks, another plate of something indulgent, another excuse to continue reveling in the fantasy of their own making. And then, just as the dessert menus were placed in front of us, I excused myself. I stood slowly, smoothing out my dress, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear, casual, unhurried, completely at ease, the picture of a dutiful daughter who had simply stepped away for a moment, who had no reason to rush, who had no reason to be anything other than exactly what they expected me to be. They didn't even glance up as I walked away, too absorbed in their own world, too comfortable in their assumptions, too certain that they had already won. But as I stepped out into the cool evening air, I reached into my purse, pulled out the little slip of paper I had printed earlier that day, and placed it neatly on the table beside my half-finished drink. A single note, a single line. "The reservation is in your name. Enjoy the bill." And then, without looking back, I walked away. The restaurant was alive with the quiet hum of conversation, the clinking of silverware against fine china, and the soft murmur of music playing in the background. a carefully curated atmosphere designed to make every guest feel as though they were part of something exclusive, something special, something that only a select few could afford. My parents fit right in, or at least they believed they did, sitting comfortably at their prime table near the floor-to-ceiling windows, sipping on expensive drinks as if they had been born into a life of luxury rather than spending decades faking one. They had no idea what was coming. Even after I had excused myself, they had barely noticed, too caught up in their own sense of victory, too busy indulging in the illusion that they had, once again, pulled one over on me without consequence. My mother flipped through the dessert menu with a delighted grin, her fingers trailing over the selections as if she were deciding on the most important choice of her life, while my father leaned back in his chair, swirling the last remnants of his whiskey in his glass, his expression one of pure satisfaction. I imagine them laughing, maybe even exchanging smug glances, already discussing which luxury restaurant they would treat me to next, not realizing that the game they had been playing for years had just ended, not on their terms but on mine. The waiter arrived at their table, a polite smile on his face, standing with the effortless confidence that came with knowing he was about to deliver a bill that most people would hesitate before signing off on. He reached into the small black leather folio he was holding, slipping out the receipt, neatly folding it before placing it down between them, a quiet, understated moment that should have gone unnoticed. But this time it didn't, because this time there was no me sitting across from them, pulling out my wallet before they even had to glance at the total. And my parents, in all their arrogance, didn't notice that detail until it was far too late. Let's see what damage we did," my father joked, reaching for the bill with the same casual attitude he always had, the same air of someone who knew he would never actually have to pay the price for his actions. He unfolded the receipt, glanced at the total, and then, for the first time all night, he froze. I wished I could have seen the exact moment when his expression shifted, when realization dawned on him like a slow-moving car crash, when he finally understood that this wasn't just another free meal at my expense. I imagined the subtle changes in his posture, the tightening of his grip on the paper, the way his throat must have bobbed slightly as he swallowed down the first wave of panic. And then, my mother, noticing his reaction, leaned over to look for herself, probably expecting to see a reasonable amount, something slightly indulgent but well within the acceptable range of what they had assumed I was willing to cover. But that wasn't what she saw. Instead, she saw a number far higher than anything they had ever ordered before, a number that reflected the extravagant choices they had made, the high-end entrees, the overpriced cocktails, the multiple rounds of drinks that had been added to the total without hesitation, all because they had never once considered that they might actually have to pay. And then, just as my father's head lifted, his eyes scanning the room, searching for me, the next piece of the trap fell into place. Because I wasn't there. For the first time, I wasn't sitting there, silently absorbing their entitled behavior, waiting for them to casually thank me as they stood up and left. For the first time, I had left them exactly as they had left me so many times before, stuck with the consequences of their own actions. My mother's hand slowly lowered to her lap, her fingers curling slightly as if gripping onto something that wasn't there, her lips parting as she turned to my father, her voice just slightly higher-pitched than before. "Where's Mia?" He didn't answer. He was still looking, still scanning, still expecting me to appear, still holding on to the false belief that I was just in the bathroom, that I had simply stepped outside, that I hadn't actually left them there to deal with the mess they had made. But I was gone. And then, before they could fully process what was happening, before they could scramble to come up with an excuse or a plan, the waiter returned with a payment folio, standing politely, expectantly, waiting for the only thing left to happen. And this was the moment, the final, perfect moment where everything came crashing down in real time, where my parents, for the first time in their lives, would experience what it felt like to sit there and realize that no one was coming to rescue them. My father reached for his wallet, pulling out his credit card with forced confidence, slipping it into the folio as if it was just another routine payment, as if this wasn't a turning point in the narrative they had written for themselves. But as the waiter took it, stepping away for a brief moment before returning, his polite, professional smile now tinged with something else, something hesitant, something carefully measured. The final trap snapped shut. "I'm so sorry, sir," the waiter said, his voice quiet but firm, his hands clasped in front of him as he placed the card back down on the table. "But it looks like your card has been declined." And just like that, the game was over. My father stared down at the credit card sitting in the waiter's outstretched hand, his fingers tightening into a fist beside his plate, his jaw clenching so hard that I half expected to hear his teeth grind together. My mother, sitting rigid in her seat, let out a sharp, nervous laugh, a forced sound that barely masked the underlying panic that was already settling into her posture. She shifted slightly, her fingers tapping against the table, her eyes darting around the room, as if looking for an escape that wasn't there. For the first time in their lives, they had no way out. The waiter remained still, his expression neutral, his training evident in the way he didn't make them feel any more embarrassed than they already were, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, of understanding, of amusement carefully hidden behind professionalism. He had probably seen it before, people pretending to be wealthier than they were, people acting like they belonged in places they couldn't afford, people who spent years faking success until reality finally caught up to them. And now, my parents were just another pair of fools caught in a lie too big to maintain. "Are you sure?" my father said, his voice gruff, low, filled with a kind of forced authority he used when trying to intimidate people into ignoring his mistakes. "That's impossible. Try it again." The waiter didn't even blink, simply inclining his head slightly before turning away, heading back toward the register, leaving behind a silence so thick that it felt like the entire restaurant had suddenly gone quiet. My mother exhaled, reaching into her purse with shaky hands, pulling out another card, one I recognized immediately. A backup, a desperate attempt to maintain the illusion for just a little longer. She pushed it toward the edge of the table, smoothing out the edges, trying to regain control, trying to pretend that this was just a minor inconvenience, something they could brush off, something that wouldn't matter in the grand scheme of things. But it did matter. Because they had spent years building a reality in which they were above consequences, in which they could manipulate situations to their benefit, in which their daughter was always available to clean up the mess before it became too obvious. But tonight, there was no one to save them. From where I sat, positioned just far enough away to watch but close enough to hear every frantic whisper, I could see the cracks forming, could see the way their carefully crafted personas were beginning to collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. This wasn't just about a bill, it was about power, about control, about the realization that they had lost both and didn't know how to function without them. The waiter returned, his face unreadable, but I already knew what he was going to say before the words even left his mouth. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach the neighboring tables. "But this card has also been declined." My mother's entire body tensed, her fingers gripping the tablecloth as if grounding herself against the inevitable wave of humiliation that was about to come crashing down around her. My father, red-faced and furious, let out a sharp exhale, running a hand through his hair before muttering under his breath, his eyes darting toward the exit as if he were considering whether or not he could just walk out without anyone stopping him. But that was the thing about places like this, they didn't let people walk out without paying. And now, the restaurant staff was growing impatient. It started as a few curious glances from surrounding tables, subtle at first, the kind of looks that people exchanged when something out of the ordinary was happening nearby. But as the tension grew, as the whispers between my parents became more frantic, as my father gestured angrily toward the waiter, while my mother dug through her purse in a way that was more for show than anything else, the attention started to shift, the quiet conversations around the room dwindling, the realization spreading that something was happening, something worth watching. And that was when I decided it was time to step in. I stood slowly, taking my time, making sure they saw me before I even spoke, watching as recognition dawned in their expressions, followed by something else, something sharp, something angry, something desperate. Because in that moment they knew. They knew I had never planned to pay. They knew I had set them up. They knew that for the first time in their lives, they were the ones being left behind. "Oh, wow," I said, keeping my voice just loud enough to carry, just soft enough to sound perfectly innocent, my smile sharp, my movements deliberate as I slid my chair back and took a slow step toward their table. "This is awkward. Looks like your cards aren't working." My mother turned to me, her eyes wide, pleading, her lips parting as if she was about to beg, about to demand, about to throw out whatever excuse she thought might work. My father, on the other hand, was furious, his jaw set, his fingers clenching around the edge of the table as if physically restraining himself from making a scene. "Mia," he said, his voice a low growl, barely masking the humiliation sitting just beneath the surface. "This isn't funny. Just pay the damn bill." And there it was, the expectation, the demand, the assumption that no matter what had happened, no matter how far things had gone, I would still be the one to fix it. But I wasn't that person anymore. I crossed my arms, tilting my head slightly, letting my gaze sweep over the scene, over the staff waiting for a resolution, over the guests pretending not to eavesdrop but failing miserably, over my parents sitting there, trapped, caught, exposed. And then, slowly, deliberately, I leaned down just enough so that my voice was meant only for them. My words sharp, cutting, final. "I covered your bills for years," I whispered, my tone unwavering, unshaken, unapologetic. "Consider this my way of letting you return the favor." I straightened, smiled sweetly, and then, before they could say another word, before they could grasp at one last attempt to manipulate their way out of the hole they had dug, I turned and walked away. And as I stepped outside, the last thing I heard was the unmistakable sound of my father's voice, sharp and desperate, followed by my mother's panicked whisper, a frantic attempt to salvage whatever dignity they had left. But there was nothing left to salvage. Because tonight, for the first time, everyone saw them for exactly who they were. I didn't need to turn around to know what was happening inside the restaurant. Didn't need to see my father's face turn red with rage, or my mother's eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for someone, anyone, who might swoop in and save them from the mess they had made. I had seen them manipulate situations too many times before, had watched them shift blame with the ease of seasoned professionals, had listened to them twist reality into whatever version suited them best, but this time was different. This time, there was no backup plan, no safety net, no easy way out. They were completely, undeniably on their own. The night air was crisp as I stepped outside, the sounds of the city humming softly in the background, a stark contrast to the chaos I had just left behind. For a brief moment, I simply stood there, inhaling deeply, letting the weight of years of obligation, of expectation, of being treated as nothing more than a financial crutch slowly roll off my shoulders. I had won. Not in a loud, dramatic way, not in the way they would have expected, but in the only way that truly mattered, by walking away and finally letting them deal with the consequences of their own choices. But I wasn't naive. I knew it wasn't over yet. And sure enough, not even 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed violently in my pocket, message after message flooding in, each one a desperate attempt to regain control, to rewrite the narrative before it was too late. "Mom, Mia, this isn't funny. Come back inside. Now." "Dad, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you're embarrassing yourself. Pay the damn bill and stop acting like a child." "Mom, this is beyond disrespectful. I cannot believe you would do something like this to your own parents." I let out a slow breath, shaking my head slightly as I scrolled through the messages, each one more frantic than the last, each one dripping with the same entitlement that had defined my entire relationship with them for as long as I could remember. Even now, even after everything, they still believed they were the victims. I didn't respond. I let them sit with it, let them stew in the discomfort of a reality where I was no longer the one they could rely on, no longer the daughter who would bend over backward to make sure they never had to feel the weight of their own irresponsibility. And then, just as I was about to put my phone away, it rang. I stared at the screen for a long moment, watching my father's name flash across the display, knowing exactly what was waiting for me on the other end of the call. It would start with anger, escalate into guilt-tripping, and if that didn't work, spiral into full-blown emotional manipulation, just like it always did. But tonight, I wasn't playing by their rules. I swiped to answer, bringing the phone to my ear, but I didn't say a word, simply waiting, letting the silence stretch long enough to make him uncomfortable, long enough for him to realize that he didn't have the upper hand this time. "Mia," he barked, his voice sharp, clipped, already filled with barely contained rage. "What the hell is wrong with you? Do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" I tilted my head slightly, glancing up at the sky, feeling strangely detached from the moment, as if I were simply an observer in a scene I had already played out 1,000 times in my head. "I imagine it's pretty humiliating," I said finally, my tone calm, even, completely unaffected by the anger rolling off of him in waves. Not as humiliating as being treated like an ATM for years, but still. A sharp inhale on the other end. "You're being ridiculous," he spat, his voice lowering now, shifting gears, moving into the part where he tried to regain control by belittling me. "You think this makes you look smart? You think you've proven something? All you've done is show everyone what a selfish, ungrateful little brat you really are." I closed my eyes for a brief second, not because his words hurt, but because I was tired of this cycle, tired of pretending that one day they would wake up and realize what they had done, tired of hoping for something that would never come. "Dad," I said quietly, my voice steady, unwavering, filled with a certainty that I knew would shake him more than any argument ever could. "I'm done." Silence. Not the kind that meant he was letting me speak, not the kind that suggested he was listening, but the kind that told me he hadn't expected this, hadn't expected me to finally, completely walk away. "What the hell does that mean?" he demanded, his voice sharp, edged with something that almost sounded like desperation. "Done with what?" "With this," I said simply, gesturing vaguely even though he couldn't see me, "with the manipulation, the guilt, the endless expectation that I would always be there to pick up the pieces when you screw up. I'm done being the person you rely on, done being the daughter who takes care of everything while you sit back and pretend you're still in control." "Mia." My mother's voice broke through now, softer, more pleading, a last-ditch effort to get me to change my mind. "Sweetheart, we're family. You don't just turn your back on family." I exhaled slowly, letting my eyes drift toward the restaurant windows, watching as they sat there, trapped, exposed, no longer the untouchable figures I had spent my whole life trying to please. "That's funny," I murmured, a quiet laugh escaping before I could stop it. "Because you've been turning your back on me for years." And then, before they could say another word, before they could spin another lie, before they could come up with one more excuse, I hung up. I stood there for a long moment, the weight of everything settling around me, pressing into my skin, but for the first time, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt like freedom. I had spent so many years believing that walking away meant losing, that standing my ground meant I was selfish, that saying no meant I was somehow failing as a daughter. But now, as I slipped my phone into my pocket and turned toward the street, I realized that sometimes the best way to win isn't to fight. It's to leave.